Pam is only slightly taller than I am. Alrighty. And I am going to try to both I'm going to see if I can stay a little bit below my time, because I know we're off by a few minutes, but if not, then I'll just cut into Angela's time. So sorry about that, Angela. Because once I get started talking about this topic, we'll see if I don't go 1 or 2 minutes over. So now I'm here wearing my full hat, which is really trying to address both ELs and early childhood, and even more fun, ELs in early childhood. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, this isn't a new topic. It's something that you've heard about before in recent administrators' forums. And so I'm going to go through the first set of slides fairly quickly, which talks a lot about the program components that are required under our current policy, which has been in place since the rules have been in place since 2010, and the policy change happened before then. So a lot of this should be familiar. If it's not familiar, get caught up, because it's really important. But I think the later slides, I'll talk a little bit more about sort of where we are now, some of the policy updates that I think a lot of you have heard about, and we just wanted to provide some clarity on. So first of all, the school code change is essentially fairly simple, but you can see it in the bilingual education sort of side of the statute. And it essentially went from saying all children kindergarten through grade 12 who are eligible for services to saying all students pre-K to grade 12 are eligible for services. So a lot of the detail you'll really find in administrative rule in section 228. Now the early childhood, and again, this will be available online, so that you have that. A lot of the early childhood administrative code is part 235. Most of the detail for this is in part 228, which is in the bilingual section. But they're available in the same place, and the easy place to find any of our rules is isb.net/rules. So the way the policy applies, because it's part of the bilingual code, is to any preschool program administered by a school district. That said, as the lawyer that I am, I always say compliance is the floor, not the ceiling. So whether or not if you're a CBO that does not receive funding through a school district, this is still really good practice, and this is what you should be doing and thinking about building capacity around. But it may not be a compliance issue for you. For our school district administered programs, it is, and that includes subgrantees. So if you have a partnership, if the grant goes through your school district, this is something that school districts are required to do. So the very first step is identifying English learners. We want to make sure that we know who becomes eligible for services. And we do that first by administering a home language survey. There's some research taking place right now nationally to revisit home language surveys. This will likely change in the future, but essentially it's 2 questions. We're asking whether the child speaks a language other than English, and whether a language other than English is spoken in the home. That doesn't identify whether or not a student is an English learner per the state definition, but it does help to identify who may be an English learner. That then triggers screening. Now, when we talk about screening, here are the questions. We've had some, well, actually, on the screening questions, we've had families that say, well, my child watches Dora, or, there's something like that going on, and we do consider those errors and correct them. But some families will say, well, my mother-in-law lives with us and she speaks Polish, but she doesn't talk to the child. So we're sure that they're not an English learner. And we go, well, we have a screening procedure that helps us get to whether or not there's an impact on the child. And some families are very nervous. Any sort of label, and I know we have a lot of the same culture with special education, I don't want to tag, I don't want what seems like a deficiency or a label on my child, so no, don't screen them. And so there's a lot of parent education that goes into really understanding what is this and what does it mean. It doesn't label your child. It creates an eligibility for services, and the services are diverse and they're intended to meet your child's needs, and we want to work with you to figure out what those are and how that happens. But essentially, if there's a yes to either of these questions, the child is then screened, and in preschool, it's within 30 days of commencement of the program. In K to 12, it's around the trigger is enrollment. So So we do want to make sure that kids are in a classroom, that they're working, that they're familiar with teachers. Ideally, we want natural setting screening. And unlike the K-12 space, we don't have a uniform screener. A lot of programs use pre-IPT, but essentially what we have in rule are prescribed screening procedures. And these procedures may look familiar to any of you who have seen NAEYC's position on screening of English learners, because we're trying to make sure that it's developmentally appropriate, it's not single point in time, we have multiple observations, ideally a team, taking parent feedback into consideration. We do then administer a uniform screener when all kids enter kindergarten, whether or not they were identified in preschool. But in preschool, we really want to make sure that it's a process like this. And even when you look at the kindergarten screener, it is very developmentally appropriate. You have an individual screener who's sitting down with a child, looking at pictures, talking through them, carrying on a conversation, expanding out sort of the level of language and understanding, really trying to gauge both the speaking and understanding of a student. But in preschool, we know it's going to look a little bit different. So, so these are the procedures. A district can come up, or a program comes up with what its procedures are going to be and how they're going to determine proficiency. So once you've gone through, identified an English learner, and this is just a little bit on what that may look like with the pre-IPT, but realize pre-IPT is not enough. It doesn't include these multiple measures. It doesn't include the family involvement, right? Like there's more to it. So make sure that you're not stopping at a single instrument. There's a notification to parents on the placement. We make sure that, that it is in the home language, that parents understand it. We make sure that they understand what kind of services will be available. We make sure that they have information around their choice, because they do have a choice on whether or not to continue within this placement. They can choose to refuse services, they can choose to withdraw, but it's not an everything or nothing. Let's say you have some self-contained classes and it's a Spanish-speaking student, and you have a class with a teacher who's bilingually endorsed, doing everything in Spanish and then developing English, and the family says, I don't want that. Well, you can then go on and offer, well, we can try to have some push-in services in a different classroom, or we can try to see if we can offer additional support in a different way. So there is a lot of parent choice involved in these placements. We have what we call in this state the TBE program and the TPI program. TBE is essentially native language instruction. It's a setting where students are actually receiving instruction in the native language, and they're always getting English as a second language. That is the case regardless of the placement. The goal to every bilingual program model is to develop English, but within those different, within the variation of types of programs where we could have two goals: develop English and continue to develop the home language. We could have just the one goal of developing English, and that could happen through transitioning a student first using their native language. It could happen through sheltered instruction to make sure our teachers are using language children already know and are scaffolding and building on that language to develop additional language, right? Not making the assumptions that all kids know, this very basic vocabulary. Well, not an English learner, not necessarily. So there are different approaches. If you have the concentration just within the preschool of 20 or more students of one language, then for K-12, we're talking about at the attendance center level, regardless of grade. But for preschool, we're talking about preschoolers. Then it's that native language instruction type of program, and there are different models that fit that. If it's less than 20, then there's more flexibility. You could still provide native language instruction, but the requirement drops down to being support along with ESL and other components. So, so here's a little bit about what is needed, what that may look like, and you're going to have all of this information available, but I think there's a lot to absorb, and a lot of folks will ask, well, what program should we have? How many teachers should we have? What's the, how does this all work? And a lot of it comes through developing a program, right? Compliance is setting these requirements around type of program, but selecting the right program is really a very strategic decision that we'll talk a little bit more about. So, this is not a question of minutes like other areas that you may be used to. It is about providing the services that a child needs. There's a big difference between a child that maybe even attended preschool in another country and has begun to develop those pre-literacy skills, and a child that maybe only has grandma or aunt or someone who's living at home that they may not be interacting with much. They may not speak that other language, but they may have had more limited exposure to English, as we know can be the case in homes where there may be a low level of English development, whether it's a monolingual home or a bilingual home, right? We know that the language that kids are exposed to has a lot to do with their language development. So we have, one of the great pieces, we have just recently adopted these new standards. So we've had English language development standards, and then we adopted an early version of pre-K English language development standards. We now have early English language development standards that are aligned to all of our domain areas, because there is language involved in physical development. There is language involved in health. There is language involved in social emotional learning, right? And all of that language is really a bridge to children being able to access those domains. So we want to make sure that we're being intentional about this. And in preschool in particular, we know that language is not independent of, English language development is not independent of language and literacy development, but it applies to every other area. And you know, I say this over and over, but particularly in our early childhood audiences, like we should get that language and social emotional development are closely tied together. Identity of self, building and developing relationships, you know, all of those types of things that are important are really intertwined with language. I remember when I was working at the parent center, I had a middle school parent who, you know, who was Spanish speaking and was really concerned about the behavior of his daughter, and he comes up and says, "Can I speak with you after a session we had done with him?" And said, "You know, I'm looking for boot camps for her." And I'm thinking, boot camps, you know, and we start to talk and figure out, well, is there something shy of sending her to a boot camp that we could be talking about? And it turns out that he didn't speak English, she didn't speak Spanish, and there was no real direct communication between them. He would speak through the siblings, or why? Because he wanted her to learn English. He wanted her to be successful. He wanted to make sure she didn't have the disadvantage of an accent or limited vocabulary. So his solution was to not speak with her at all as she was growing up. And I think, okay, what does that tell us about social emotional development and bonding and the relationships that we know are critical to learning and development? I mean, that's not what we should be setting our kids up for, and preschool is absolutely an important place. Obviously, our Birth to 3 programs and anything that we're doing to support moms, starting as early as we can, but if not sooner than in preschool, we need to be thinking about that sort of thing. And that's what should be guiding our decisions, not just what program components are we required to have in place. So these standards help with all of that. You know, they cut across all of the domains, and they actually have age level clusters, but they also have clusters based on, or they have leveling, because you could have very, very young children that have higher levels of English development, even though their literacy and language development are lower, right? And so how we tease those out and really know what it looks like at different ages and stages makes a huge difference. So definitely you should take a look at those. We'll get this out to you, but the websites and all of that are available. We're developing more and more resources and looking to develop a companion document to our standards for Illinois, trainings for you. There are online webinars already on these standards. So now talking about the requirements. So we know that we have to meet our preschool for all requirements already, and so you have to have that early childhood endorsed teacher with a professional educator license. But we did make some modifications to the requirements that we have. Many of you are probably aware initially, as of July 1st, 2014, we were supposed to have dually certified teachers in our preschool classrooms that had both the early childhood endorsement and the bilingual or ESL endorsement if they were working with English learners, right? This wasn't statewide, every single preschool teacher, but it is important for those teachers that are working with English learners. Well, now trying to catch up with things, we're continuing to develop more resources, and we're working with you to get there, but we know a lot of programs need a little bit more time to get there. So the requirement changed. We pushed off the absolute sort of deadline to 2016, but in the interim, we want to make sure that everyone is taking the steps necessary. Some of your programs may be there already, and if they are, continue doing what you're doing and maintain it. But for those programs that aren't, what we're requiring this school year and next school year, which are already after the initial deadline, right? So by now, it's not that there hasn't been notice about this. Most programs should have been there, but we know, it was a heavy lift, and we're continuing to do that work. We're requiring a plan. Now, why require a plan? Is this just one more thing? Is it our punishment for not getting there by July 1st, 2014? Maybe. No, it isn't. It is not a punishment, right? It really is a tool. And actually, our superintendent is very big on making sure we're not requiring things that aren't necessary. And he asked me, why are we requiring this plan? Is it a punishment? And I said, no, it's not a punishment. This is to do something that we think you should be doing already, but if you're not, this becomes an opportunity. It's a plan that has to demonstrate both how you're going to get to July 1, 2016, but also how you're serving English learners today, because it's been several years since the requirement kicked in. We can't lose cohorts of students while we're trying to get the system to where it needs to be, right? So our students need to be served and need to have their needs met now. And one of the pieces, at the bottom is the plan has to be developed and monitored jointly between our early childhood and our EL administrators. Why develop it jointly? Well, because one, two heads are better than one, but if you take an EL head and an early childhood head, the questions these folks have can often be answered by the folks over here, and the questions these folks have can often be answered. I mean, we'll get asked very basic questions, and I get asked questions from both sides. So I'm in an EL directors meeting, and they go, but I don't know what curriculum looks like in preschool. That looks different, right? But I don't know what it looks like. Well, go talk to your early childhood person. I'm pretty sure they can tell you a thing or two about curriculum in preschool. And then in early childhood spaces, I'll hear things like, well, I don't know what program models are or how they get incorporated, and we can't find Arabic teachers. We're in a community where, and I go, you know what? Your bilingual director has been doing that and working on that for a long time. If there's a population in your community, Spanish-speaking, Polish-speaking, Arabic-speaking, they've been serving them all of these years. So ask them how they're recruiting. Try to figure out what strategies are being employed in your district. So that's why we've put this plan into place. And as I said, I'll probably cut in a few more minutes into Angela's time. So we really, I pulled, again, as I beg, borrow, and steal from folks on good ideas, I plucked this little plan, act, check from Cindy's presentation this morning. Planning is so important to doing what we need to do. So we want to make sure that you start with needs assessment, right? A little bit of information about who you're serving, and then move into program and service design, and then think about staffing. Because I think the questions we've been getting, folks start with staffing. Well, how many teachers do I need to have? What do they need? And I go, it depends on what you're doing. What kind of services are you providing? What kind of program do you need, right? That's how we make those staffing decisions. So we're going to make a template available, and that will be available on the EL website, and I'm sure on the early childhood one as well. But in the needs assessment, we're going to ask you things like, what kind of preschool services do you have available? Do you have full day, half day? Do you have multiple sessions? We're going to ask you about your enrollments of students. What languages do they speak? How many? Do you have 12 ELs that all speak a different language? Or do you have 12 ELs that all speak the same language, right? That's a very different type of implication depending on the population that you have and the concentration. We've got 3 ELs, we've got 300 ELs, right? I mean, all of those types of things. How they're concentrated. Do you have multiple sites? And are they spread out across them? Or, do you have one site that has a heavier population? And we're going to ask you about the EL model and service delivery in K-2. Why? Because these programs are tied to school district administered programs. We talk about vertical transitions all the time and how important it is to have that alignment and make sure that our kids are transitioning smoothly. Well, if you have ELs in preschool, I guarantee you your school district has ELs in K-2. So how are they being served? What kind of programs are available? I remember when this whole thing started, folks dove into the literature. You know, as excited as we are, what do? First thing, oh, we have this requirement. Let me go and find best practices, right? That's the beauty of the early childhood field. Well, folks came back and said, we're going to start a dual language program. And they were an isolated preschool. And I said, okay, you know that dual language programs run usually 8 years or so, you know, at the very least. It's a longitudinal program. Oh, but we only do 3s and 4s. It's like, well, then maybe you need to communicate with your feeder schools and talk about what kind of program they have and how you click those together, how you make sure that there's continuity of services. If all of your English learners are going to feed into a program that's native language instruction in Polish, and you're designing a program that doesn't have that component, there's going to be a disconnect for those kids, right? And you want to make sure that you can mediate that as much as you can. So we're going to ask you these types of questions first so that you can assess need. Then we're asking you about program and service design. First question is, what are you aspiring to build? We know you're not there yet. We know you don't have the staff in place yet. But what kind of program? And that could be, it could be that you are working to do a dual language program, or maybe it's a transitional program, or it's sheltered instruction or something like that. What kind of how will it be delivered? It may be self-contained. It may be that it's appropriate to push in. You may have a co-teaching model, something like that. You know, there's a wide variety. And these are all things that your bilingual director counterparts are used to talking about and thinking through. And that's why you have to have this conversation together. And then we're going to ask you, okay, now, how are you actually planning on serving kids in the interim on a pipeline to get there? What are you doing? What kind of materials are you going to make available, professional development, et cetera, while you're getting the endorsed teachers that really need to be in place to fully implement this model? And then we'll talk about staffing and ask you, what does your staffing look like now? Who are your teachers? What credentials do they have? What endorsements? What role do they play? Is it a classroom teacher, a resource, itinerant support, assistant? And then what kind of recruitment and professional development are you offering? Are you growing your own? Are you recruiting? Are you trying to maybe bridge with your K-12 space and, you know, implement some innovative co-teaching? Like, how is this going to work for you to really realistically get to July 1, 2016? So there is a lot of information available online. We do have FAQs and a resource page on English learners and preschool, and both divisions are available to answer questions about all of this. So thank you.